Hello, this is Fiona Cuthbertson coming from the pod to record another episode of Off the Cuff. This week we're lucky enough to have Professor Emmeline Taylor. Professor Taylor is Professor of Criminology at City St George's, University of London, specialising in understanding serious acquisitive crime and business crime, particularly focusing on the retail sector. To help ensure that government and police crack this issue, she is chair of the Business Crime Reduction Partnership's National Standards Board, academic lead on the Strategic Oversight Board for Business Crime, and a member of both the National Retail Crime Steering Group and the Home Office Commercial Victimisation Survey expert panel. She also hosts the podcast Retail Crime Uncovered and is often featured on national TV and other podcasts, including this one. Welcome, Professor Taylor.
Hi, Fiona. It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you very much. So, firstly, can you tell us what drove your interest into serious acquisitive crime and business crime?
You know, I can trace this back to being a little girl. So I grew up in South Manchester and I lived right next door to a co-op grocery store. So I remember from a really young age having witnessed shoplifting. I remember distinctly quite a serious armed robbery. And I also remember an overnight commercial burglary where they quite expertly managed to cut the safe through our shared party wall in the garden and dragged it through the garden. Much to my mum's displeasure, all the flower beds got trampled. And so I just remember from such an early age being fascinated about the mindset of criminals and particularly around acquisitive crime. And it's absolutely just set the tone for my whole career. You know, fast forward decades and I'm still pondering over what drives these offenders to commit such a range of offences.
And taking a step back, what are the main types of retail crime and how has it changed?
So retail crime is quite a broad category of offences that encapsulates everything from robbery, whether that's armed or unarmed robbery, commercial burglary, shoplifting, and also an increasing level of violent, aggressive behaviour within the retail space. We also see retail locations as attractors of antisocial behaviour, criminal damage. So there's a huge array of different offences that take place in and around bricks and mortar stores. Now, of course, in terms of retail, we've also got e-commerce in terms of there could be fraudulent activity. We've also seen the cyber attacks that have impacted on major household names. So there's almost no crime type that doesn't occur in or around a retail space.
And how does retail crime affect retail workers and the community, as well as the economy?
So the impacts are huge. And going back to 2019, I produced a report on behalf of the co-op as part of their Safer Colleagues, Safer Communities campaign. And for the first time, that report documented the growing levels of violence and verbal abuse that was being experienced by shop workers who were just simply trying to serve their community. And I liken their experiences to being frontline in other sectors because the experiences they were having, the cumulative harm day in, day out, the fear factor of never quite knowing when you were going to be assaulted or verbally abused, the fear of, am I going to be followed home today? Because that was often a threat. You know, I know where you live. I'll be waiting for you when you're locking up today. All of these very real threats that shop workers face. These individuals were reporting post-traumatic stress disorder or panic attacks, sleepless nights, anxiety. And unfortunately, it meant for some, they took the really difficult decision to leave a job that they once loved. And also that places them in financial difficulties. I think it's really important to highlight that over 60% that work on the front line are females. Looking at it through a lens of violence against women and girls, there's a pledge to halve VORG in the next 10 years. And I think the retail sector would be a really fruitful place to begin some of that campaign to tackle this. Now, you mentioned as well, not just the impact on those shop workers, this flows out into communities, the antisocial behaviour, a climate of fear. And if a store can no longer operate safely and profitably, well, then there's a real risk that it might actually have to close permanently. And that can then have a huge impact on communities, particularly the more remote ones, who might then not be able to access fresh food, vegetables, medicines, etc., within a reasonable distance. So it's really important, I think, to just recognise the huge impact that this can have.
How does the low value shoplifting rule, i.e. anything under £200 is only dealt with summarily, affect prosecution rates?
It's a great question, and this is one that is hotly debated, and I do enjoy having a quite forthright discussion about this. So the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act in 2014 reclassified shoplifting of goods of a value of £200 or less as low value shoplifting. And that was with really good intentions. The idea was that you could have swift justice. So those individuals would no longer have to be sent through the magistrates' courts and have a lengthy criminal justice intervention. They could actually just be dealt with a fixed penalty notice, so almost on the spot. And we know from criminological research, some of the most effective justice is that rapid intervention. Now, unfortunately, what happened, despite those good intentions, is that the fixed penalty notices weren't issued either. So it essentially sent a message to offenders that so long as you steal up to £200, very little action is going to be taken. I think the police almost used it, rightly or wrongly, as a bit of a shorthand as to what level of action they needed to take. Now, just to evidence that, in the year end to March 2024, there were 431 fixed penalty notices issued to shoplifters, and that's a 98% drop from 10 years ago. So that really illustrates that nothing is happening if you steal for less than that value. And offenders got to the point where they almost felt that this was the law. Oh, if I steal £199 of goods, well, you can't touch me, because they really thought that that was actually the case. Now, that's a scary position to be in. Now, it's not just at that end of the spectrum that we've seen a reduction in sanctions against shoplifters, charges, prison sentences. They've all decreased dramatically in the last decade. So some might go so far as to say that we've decriminalised shop theft.
And retailers need to sell an additional 12 items to make up for each item that's stolen. So how does that impact a retail business on the whole?
Finances are really challenging, like particularly within grocery, they work to very narrow margins. So if something is stolen, they do need to recoup their losses. We've heard many ways of calculating this. The Retail Trust suggests that £133 is added to the average person's household shopping bill annually as a direct result of shop theft. So this is hitting everybody's pocket. Your hardworking, honest customers, your hardworking businesses that are trying to serve their communities and struggling to operate profitably, and then also more broadly, the economy. It's suggested that shop theft now costs the economy over £3 billion. So this is really an issue that has got out of hand in recent years.
And as I said in my introduction, you've been part of a number of partnerships and groups furthering action in this area. How do you ensure that these meetings really do change the landscape on the front line and aren't just talking shops?
I think we've all been there, haven't we, where we've sat in a meeting and suddenly thought, oh, goodness, this is an hour of my life. I'm not going to get back and nothing is going to come from it. Now, I'm really, really grateful that I've managed to be part of multiple partnerships that are really action driven, and it's around problem solving. For too long, there was a lot of admiring the problem, let's say, lots of discussions about what was wrong and not enough focus on, well, what can we do about it? So for me, it's always about bringing the evidence base to the fore. What's been done before, what works, what's effective, and how do you deploy effective interventions? We're in such a better place than we were 5 years ago. And the real key to that is the willingness of different partners to sit around the table together. I can recall a time not that long ago where the industry would point the finger at the police would point the finger at the industry, and very little progress would be made. I think there's now a genuine commitment on both sides that the police can't arrest their way out of this issue and the industry can't solve this on their own. Then we've also got technology providers, we've got the broader criminal justice system, we've got legislators, policymakers. There's a real combined effort here now to make sure that those meetings, those partnerships translate into meaningful strategy and then delivery plans.
You mentioned the research papers and books that you've undertaken. So what key piece of information has been uncovered through this research?
It's around understanding the different drivers of shoplifting. So for a while, I think we saw offenders as almost a homogenous group. And it's really important to separate them out, because any effective solution has to be tailored to the root causes. So we know, for example, that you have opportunistic thieves, and they can be dealt with through target hardening. You've then got drug affected individuals, and these are a large proportion of shop thieves. So they steal day in, day out to fund a habit. And they can steal eye-watering amounts. They typically get around a third to a half of the RRP of an item. They need to probably be stealing between £500 and £1,500 worth a day for the more entrenched drug-affected individuals. Sending them to prison for 4 weeks at a time, they're just on a revolving door. To tackle those offenders, they need rehabilitation rather than a punitive custodial sentence, which will probably just actually make things worse. But there's other types of criminality. So we've got organised criminal networks that have been targeting the UK sector because they see it as high reward and low risk. And I think that's only really been illuminated in recent years, just how good they've been at going under the radar. They take advantage of the fact that there's 43 police forces, and if they travel in between them, often the communication isn't particularly strong. And so they've managed to get away with stealing in multiple different police force areas without this coming to attention. We've now got Pegasus, or it's dubbed Operation Pegasus, the retail strand of Opal, which is a serious organised acquisitive crime unit, a national policing unit. They're piecing together, joining the dots, and finally being able to illuminate these networks that are operating across the country. But there's also a fourth category of offenders that I've identified through my research: criminal entrepreneurs or shoplifting entrepreneurs. I would say are a relatively new category of offender, but they're intelligent, they're determined, they've worked out the best way to exploit retailers and not come to the attention of the police, and they're making huge sums of money from it. So let's tease out these different profiles so we can begin to understand what the most appropriate response would be, but also to give retailers some red flags or how to spot suspicious behaviour, because we're not necessarily looking for the type of offender who might be opportunistic or those entrepreneurial ones, because they'll be very well dressed, they'll be well spoken, and they'll be intelligent. They know how to evade detection. So I hope that's been helpful for the sector and for policing to begin to understand the different profiles and modus operandi.
You've previously mentioned the fact that it is important that everybody works together and that there is an ongoing and collaborative approach. Do you feel that is enough being done by these groups to reduce this type of crime?
I think we have to be realistic about how much can be done at any one time. Huge strides have been made in recent years. I've mentioned the strand of Opal. There's also the Tackling Retail Crime Together strategy, which has commitment from police and industry and is also supported by the former policing minister. So I think there's lots of pockets of fantastic activity. I think the point that we've reached now is that we have a strategy, we have the ideas, we understand the problem very well, but we're still in a context of under-resourced policing, a increasingly complex criminality with online frauds, etc., that take up a lot of policing time. So I think where we're at now is really trying to build a sense of exactly what works in what context, and to be a little bit smarter around the deployment of law enforcement. I can see a real opportunity coming up with the changes around sentencing to alleviate the burgeoning prison population. And I think there's a real opportunity around out-of-court resolutions and also restorative justice, because time and time again, I speak to offenders and they see this as a victimless crime.
You mentioned earlier the place of politicians in dealing with this issue. We know that retail crime is a cross-party issue. How does the government need to engage with the opposition to ensure enough is being done to change things?
Retail is the biggest private sector employer in the UK. We all know somebody who works in a shop. And so I think that's why this really resonates. But it also speaks to so many different government priorities. So across both parties, you know, whether that is violence against women and girls, whether it's around knife crime, antisocial behaviour, youth offending, the economy, supporting small businesses, creating safer streets and safer spaces. There's not really any policy agenda that this doesn't fit into. And I think that's why it has resonated with so many politicians. I think we do need to be mindful as a government pushes through legislation that not just to be oppositional for the sake of it. I think this is really important for society. It's too important for the economy to begin to play party politics around this issue. I think already seeing some of the discussions that are happening around the crime and policing bill, overall, I feel heartened that this is something that is going to really benefit and support the retail sector.
The recent second reading of the Crime and Policing Bill in the Lords spelled out two main changes that the government are putting in place, namely the removal of the £200 threshold you mentioned earlier and the creation of a specific offence for those that attack shop workers. We've just been talking about people working cross-party, but not everyone has been in agreement that those are the right changes. So do you feel that they will change things on the front line?
It's too important to not flesh out the details and raise concerns, make challenges. That's absolutely what policy making is all about. Are these the right two core pieces of legislation? They've not appeared overnight. And in fact, both of these were included in the report I mentioned. It's not part of the job that was published back in 2019. And there's clear rationales that underscore both of them. I've already spoken to the 2014 £200 limit, and yes, it was brought in for the right reasons. The execution of it or the implementation of it sadly did not work. And so I think it's absolutely right that we need to remove what's become quite an arbitrary line in the sand in terms of £200. You could steal to the value of £6, but there could be aggression alongside it. So the value, I just think, is not relevant in this context. We need to look more holistically at offences. Now, the other one, the assaulting shop workers, there's multiple reasons why that's important to bring in the standalone offence. Firstly, it's almost impossible to measure the number of assaults against shop workers because the victim is the individual, and so the location in which it takes place isn't necessarily recorded as being relevant. We need to be able to measure this because we need to be able to have data points to show how effective any sort of measures are in reducing it. Emergency workers have a similar standalone offence. And I think, sadly, the number of assaults that are occurring against shop workers does justify the fact that they would then have this. But we can also look to Scotland, and they enacted a similar piece of legislation, and they've had great successes around that. So not only are victims more willing to report an offence because they now feel that it's recognised, and so there will be a response, there is also then a greater response, so that does play out. And so we're seeing more charges against individuals who assault shop workers. I can't see how any of that is problematic. It illuminates the problem. It gives us vital data that we need, and it sends a clear message to victims, you will be supported, and a clear message to perpetrators that this is not acceptable.
I was going to mention that the British Independent Retailers Association have recently shown 82% of retailers don't bother reporting physical attacks on their staff. What support needs to be given to police on a local level in order to ensure that they can fully implement the new rules?
Then maybe an uptick in reporting, which we need to have. And I think what it's also going to show is those links with things like hate-motivated incidents. We know retail is a bit of a driver of hate-motivated crime. So I think it'll begin to illuminate lots of different things that have perhaps been hidden for a while. Does it place more pressure on police resources? Possibly. But I imagine that the individuals that feel emboldened to walk into a store and assault somebody who's just working behind the counter is not only committing offences in a shop. I imagine they're also violent at home. They may be violent in the community, violent in the nighttime economy. And so whilst it may appear to place more pressures on policing resources, I imagine because retail is such an evidence-rich location, the CCTV, body-worn cameras, sometimes facial recognition, this could actually be efficient, I think, for police by providing that evidence to catch some of these individuals who are causing crimes all across the community. But I think there's also a role here for neighbourhood policing, for business crime reduction partnerships, who are often the eyes and ears in a community around antisocial behaviour and retail crime. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. But overall, I think being able to identify violent perpetrators in the community can only be a good thing.
What's the next thing that you're going to be tackling?
So we focus a huge amount on the shop thieves themselves and not necessarily the markets in which they're selling stolen goods. Sometimes this is other businesses that are purchasing stolen goods. They might buy fresh food, which they then serve up in cafes, restaurants, pubs, or it might be items such as chocolate and wine that is then being sold on in other stores. We also know that car boot sales are key places for the onward sale of stolen goods. So for me, the next iteration of this is to disrupt those stolen goods markets. And that's a big piece of work because there's so many different disposal routes. So I've mentioned some of them there, but also e-commerce is a real driver for the onward sale of stolen goods. So particularly peer-to-peer e-commerce platforms can be problematic, and it's sometimes very hard to tell whether something is stolen. Other times it's very obvious that something has been stolen, but people are willing to turn a blind eye if the price is right. So I think we need to educate people around the impacts that they're having if they buy stolen goods. What has the journey of that item actually been? Who's been hurt? What business has suffered as well? Not just people. And then we also need to have stronger investigations to be able to shut down some of these disposal routes. We're seeing some brilliant activity in this space at the moment, but a more concerted national effort, I think, is required.
And finally, do you feel positive about what's been achieved so far and what can be achieved in the future?
I do. I genuinely do. If you'd asked me that question maybe 5 years ago, I don't think I would have been quite committed. But I think there's just such great examples around partnership work, around collaboration. The technology is increasingly assisting in this space, so it's not always as laborious as it has been previously. So I think the tide is really beginning to turn on acquisitive crime. I don't think we can ever sort of quite take our finger off the pulse because I think this is always going to be an issue. But the appetite and the commitment that I've seen across the industry, policing and government in recent years, it has been really positive.
Professor Taylor, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. It's been very interesting to hear about your work on retail crime and how important it is that we all work together to ensure retailers can just do their job. Thank you to you, the listeners, who hopefully enjoyed the show as much as we've enjoyed making it. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment. If you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. If you feel you need something to tide you over to the next podcast, please buy my book Party Games on Amazon. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Hope you have a good week, one and all.